this basically prompted major economies like the United States and Australia to assess or evaluate the health of their supply chains.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Matters of national security are increasingly stretching beyond hard power and into areas of economics, technology, and energy. Critical minerals and the clean energy transition are now a core aspect of the US-Australia alliance, and they are also playing a larger role in US-China competition and domestic politics and geopolitics around the globe. How do critical minerals and the clean energy transition relate to national security? How could the US presidential election impact the clean energy transition? And what can allies and partners do to work together on these issues? To discuss these questions, we're delighted to welcome Jane Nakano, Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. She previously worked with the U.S. Department of Energy and at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo as Special Assistant to the Energy Attaché. And she recently visited Australia to work with USSC's Women in the Alliance initiative. Welcome to the podcast, Jane.
Thank you so much, Mary.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get your by the numbers stat on this topic. Are you ready to go on that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, looking forward to it. So to kick things off, I was recently thinking about the USSC's Economic Security Conference, where we heard from government leaders about how issues like trade and critical minerals and clean energy are increasingly issues of national security. So how do you see this playing out in the energy sector, and how does US-China competition factor in?
The notion of national security has really expanded to publicly include the notion of national economic security, in my view. But also it's important to note that the security of supply chains is this common thread that sort of goes through these issue areas like trade, critical minerals, and also clean energy technologies. We had sort of 2 decades at least of this global economic integration that prioritized efficiency over resilience. But in the earlier part of this decade, a confluence of factors like COVID-related supply chain disruptions, but then also the resurgence of the great power competition happened. And this basically prompted major economies like the United States and Australia to assess or evaluate the health of their supply chains against supply chain disruptions. So I think strengthening supply chains is a major priority in the energy sector. Clean energy technologies are key to decarbonization, and what underpins these technologies are critical minerals, like lithium, cobalt, nickel. But then also clean energy technologies do have energy security benefit, in my view. They help us diversify our energy supply chains away from fossil fuels that are much more perhaps vulnerable to commodity market cycles and price fluctuations the way that critical minerals are not. Of course, critical mineral markets are also quite dynamic, but I think having both fossil fuels, but increasingly renewables help diversify energy sources. So I think these are very much getting us much more focused on supply chain securities in the energy sector. So I may also add that, both the critical minerals and clean energy technologies are highly concentrated in China. The global supply chains are, quite geographically just non-diversified. I think that's where we're starting to see this national economic security discussion become much more on the sort of a top tier issue for a lot of policymakers, not just in Washington, but in Canberra, Brussels, Tokyo, Seoul. But I think, I wouldn't really necessarily see this as sort of a US-China sort of a competition piece. I think that generally a market monopoly reduces economic competition, right? So,
Uh-huh.
and especially when the actor is so dominant, but then also, the economic system is not based on sort of the open, private capital model, and with the huge use of state-owned entities, a lot of economies are right to be more concerned about the geopolitical driven supply chain disruption risks. Uh, and not to miss the fact that the critical minerals are something that I think Beijing is starting to recognize as its potential geopolitical leverage point. We've seen, quite a few assertive steps in the last 12 months or so, starting with the export restrictions on gallium and germanium products from last August. And these are, important not just for clean energy technologies, but then also semiconductor and many other modern economic technology foundations. More recently, we've also seen export control on graphites. That's very important for EVs. Uh, and so we're starting to see these assertive postures. So, but of course, China has been interested in getting more economic values out of their natural resource wealth since, I think good part of the last, 50 years or so. But yeah, so I think the West had become very comfortable with the import dependence and economic integration that sort of allow that. But I think the situation is fast changing. So again, it's sort of no surprise that we're starting to see and hear a lot of concerns over critical minerals and clean energy technologies being part of the national security discussion today.
Oh, yeah. And it's interesting how COVID exposed vulnerabilities in so many sectors around the world. And so I think the whole concept of, national security and security, when we saw these vulnerabilities in areas like supply chains and even health, all these sectors, all of a sudden security had a whole new meaning. And I think it's so now we're in that phase of, well, how do we adapt? How do we respond? How do we build up our resilience and make sure that we're secure across all of these vectors? And you mentioned, the role of technology and things like semiconductors, which I know feature heavily in President Biden's signature piece of climate change legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. So, how can you talk us through that act a little bit in terms of what it shows us about how Biden is approaching the battle against climate change in the US through the IRA?
Yeah, so climate change is the top priority area for the Biden administration. But I think the Biden administration has also sought very hard to tie that piece to sort of reindustrialization of the United States, if you will. I think it's maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the focus was much more on the deployment of clean energy technologies to address climate change and to really advance decarbonization. But the combination of China's successful industrial strategy, where China incentivized a lot of supply side interest, supply side activities, as well as demand side. I think a lot of Western OECD economies have seen their competitiveness in these technology areas, especially renewables, solar and wind, sort of deteriorate over time. So I think, politically, I think the Biden administration has realized that it's just not really viable to keep the voters' interest and perhaps commitment to decarbonization unless we address and really pursue the development, not just the deployment of the clean energy technologies at home. So, in that context, the passage of the Inflation Reductions Act back in August of 2022 was a major step. It includes combination grants, loans, tax provisions, and so many incentives to really jumpstart the deployment as well as development of these technologies at home. So I think, it's really IRA itself is a really key piece of the U.S. Green Industrial Strategy. And I think it's in the last, at least since the passage, there's much, greater focus on really implementing many of the measures and really incentivizing companies and consumers take advantage of it. So we've seen investments into the EV battery supply chains, manufacturing, basically attract about $90 billion already within the United States. And then also there's the advanced manufacturing tax credit that's, to support not just EVs and critical minerals productions, but also energy storage, solar power, wind power. What's really valuable about IRA for the business stakeholders is that these incentives are available for, about 10 years. It's essentially a budget bill. So it gives you at least 10 years of direction where businesses can plan and allocate their investments around the government. Strong signal coming out of that administration.
Moving beyond the United States, how do you see the actions taken by the United States playing out in the Indo-Pacific region?
I think the multilateral engagements are key to advance really decarbonization. United States is historically a major emitter, but I think the emerging and then also sort of fast sort of industrializing economies in the Pacific are very important partners if we want global emission levels to be really the continued focus and also to see progress made in reducing emissions level. And I think, many of these incentives coming out of the laws like the Inflation Reductions Act, but then also bipartisan infrastructure bill, they do really try to address not just some of the challenges that are associated with introducing potentially more expensive, cleaner fuels or technologies, but then also addressing these issues in much more in a system-wide manner. What I mean by that is to try to address some of the infrastructure needs that may have to be addressed before some of the economies can get to sort of resource choices. If you don't have stable grid, introducing renewables would make it even harder or complicated. And even for some of the critical minerals related global efforts to diversify the supply chains, I think having infrastructure like railroads matter to get some of these resource rich countries in Indo-Pacific. Of course, Australia is one of them, but there are a lot of other Indo-Pacific economies that may not have the type of financial muscle that Australia has. And I think as the United States tries to get sort of a group of like-minded clean energy countries to expand, I think the IRA signals a lot of opportunities.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of those issues, when it gets translated to the region in particular, turn into that tension you have with the energy trilemma between energy security and sustainability and affordability. Those trade-offs and where you land can be where some of the friction points arise. How aligned would you say that U.S. allies and partners like Australia are with the United States on the clean energy transition, which you've alluded to with the LNG a little bit already? But what would you say are the areas that are most ripe for collaboration?
I think there's a strong synergy when it comes to the Biden administration's U.S. priorities and Albanese priorities right at the moment, and how that may continue or may change warrants really close attention, in part because that could affect the scope of bilateral cooperation. But then also, I fundamentally believe that for successful multilateral engagement, which, the threats like climate change really requires, you need to still have several core bilateral relations to underpin the multilaterals. So in that sense, I think there's a great alignment right at the moment, and especially that are underpinned by the shared values, political norms. And I think you can't really discount it, how that those sort of a fundamental fabric of the two nations really allow some of these mobile operational and also policy priorities to be implemented and in cooperation to flourish. Now, I think when it comes to some of the specific areas, critical minerals really comes to my mind right away. the compact, the transformation compact that was announced back in May 2023, I believe, that also looks at these clean energy and critical minerals as really the core part of the bilaterals. But I think there's a lot of complementary capacities between the two countries. But then again, even when you look at some of the both global multilateral frameworks and also regional frameworks like Quad or the global ones like the mineral security partnerships, I think some of the tools that both Washington and Canberra are ready to leverage together would be essential. And one example is finally Australia is now considered to be the domestic source for the purpose of the Defense Production Act funding that has been more actively used by the Biden administration, but it also was, used by the Trump administration to advance critical mineral supply chains. It was only several months ago Australia joined, I guess, the ranks of Canada, basically, to be considered domestic source. And again, I think that really speaks to not just having synergy in what two countries are interested in doing, but then also the level of the alliance exists, again, based on shared values and norms.
Oh, and I'm keen to focus in a little bit on clean hydrogen in particular, because we talked about it a little bit, but it's been a massive focus here in Australia. Do you think this is an area of potential collaboration between Australia and the United States? And what would you see as kind of either the headwinds or the tailwinds for this issue?
Hydrogen is definitely an area that is important as each country tries to pursue decarbonization of its own domestic industry, but then also together, see hydrogen become much more accessible to a lot of other countries that do not have sort of a resources to produce hydrogen at a scale and at the very competitive price down the road. But right at the moment, I feel like the U.S. and Australia are both still trying to figure out the right balance for its domestic industries, especially in the case of the United States. The IRA provides very generous production tax credits for clean hydrogen production, but it's very much geared towards getting more hydrogen out the door within a decade or so to decarbonize our own industry, as opposed to trying to become a potential exporter of hydrogen molecule, whether it's in the form of hydrogen or ammonia. I think there's a bit of a difference between the US and Australia in that regard. And for that reason, I think there seems to be a bit of a concern I have been sensing from Australian colleagues and friends that, perhaps such a generous tax credit coming out of the IRA could really shift the foreign investments into Australian projects away from Australia or elsewhere into the United States. And that could happen. But at the same time, I think a lot of economies that are potential sort of robust importers of hydrogen are in East Asia as well as parts of Europe. And for that matter, I don't see necessarily just sort of a zero sum prevailing. Also, I think it's important for more potential suppliers that do have decarbonization goals to collaborate and make sure that hydrogen use will really address the challenges in the hard to abate sectors. And right at the moment, I think one of the shared challenges between the US and Australia is that, the appetite for clean hydrogen just is much weaker than what we would have liked to see by now, right? So the weaker than expected offtakes and sort of demand market formation is something that, perhaps major suppliers major prospective suppliers of hydrogen, such as the United States and Australia, could be really having much closer and active discussion. And also, I also do not want to forget that I think some of the technology related conversation is very important. Some of the national labs from the United States and Australia has Cicero. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but Ciro.
Yeah, CSIRO.
Yeah, okay. And, I think there are a lot of efforts that are undergoing to try to reduce the cost of electrolyzers. So, technology, supply chain, and innovation are also very important areas where two countries could be collaborating further.
And finally, what ideas would you say have either sparked your interest or have you been thinking about most since your trip to Australia?
I really enjoyed visiting and really hearing directly some of the questions Australian colleagues have about the future of the US energy system and in decarbonization, as well as the bilateral sort of collaboration piece. But two things actually have been on my mind since I came back from Sydney. One is Australia is very rich in natural resources, whether it's natural gas or minerals like lithium, and it'd be interesting. I'm very much interested in how, Australia would try to leverage this latest important package from the government, the Future Made in Australia, to create more economic values in the midstream and sort of downstream sort of industries. Things like EV related minerals exist, but Australia does not really have the auto industry. And so how would the sort of value creation may develop and could also be another area for collaboration and cooperation. The second area is that the carbon intensity issue is becoming increasingly important in the global trade. Back in April, the Biden administration launched a working group to really try to address these potential carbon leakage from sort of energy intensive manufacturing industries and others. And the newly inaugurated the special climate envoy, Mr. Podesta, also articulated how we really need to address that aspect of sort of a climate change effort. So it'd be really interesting to see energy and natural resource rich countries such as Australia and the United States try to uh, address that linkage. And in that context, I'm very much interested in seeing how conversation in Australia seems to be shifting from mainly about trying to export hydrogen in the form of hydrogen or ammonia, sort of in a molecule state, if you will, to perhaps also expanding the potential export of green steel, the more by leveraging your iron ore well. And as the again, this nexus between carbon intensity and global trade evolves, particularly in light of the 2026, the full implementation of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. It'd be really interesting how, sort of the Indo-Pacific or sort of the trans-Pacific side of reactions and responses, and but then also strategic advantages may emerge.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking us through such a, complex topic. And I love hearing your reflections, a little bit after the fact as these ideas have kind of like percolated and you can think about it and start to make those connections. I'm excited to see what comes from here. So now, just as we wrap up, I would love to get your by the numbers stat. What do you have for us today?
370 billion.
Okay. And what can you tell us about that?
So it's the 370 billion US dollars is the total amount of money that will be dispersed over the 10 years under the Inflation Reductions Act to support measures to improve energy security, but then also to accelerate the clean energy transitions. And tools range from, grants to tax credits and a lot of different types of incentives. So that is the number.
Wow, that is a massive number. For the Australian context, we talk a lot about 365 billion Australian dollars, which with the current exchange rate would be quite a lot lower. And that is the like upper limit of what our AUKUS program is expected to cost over the lifespan of the program. So we talk about that as just this eye-watering amount of money. And that's what President Biden is putting in just into these clean energy initiatives in the US through the IRA, which is only one part of the IRA. So that's very incredible. Wow. Thank you for sharing. So I Just want to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our audience. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchett, who's the Freeman Chair for China Studies at CSIS. And I'd also recommend checking out our USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including the panel discussion that featured Jane alongside Australian Climate Ambassador Kristen Tilley and USSC Non-Resident Senior Fellow Meg McDonald. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Jane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mari. It was my pleasure.